Welcome to the Apologist bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I really like Justin Brierley and all the things that he's done in England on Christian radio. He has a series of interviews that he does, kind of debates with unbelievers. It's called Unbelievable. So he's put a book out, and he subtitled it, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. So I'd like to look at that today. I've done I think one previous podcast where we looked at his challenging 5 statements. 1, atheism is just a lack of belief in God. Number 2, God didn't create humans. Humans created God. Number 3, so out of the thousands of religions, yours just happens to be right. Number 4, a God who'd send me to hell for not believing in him isn't worth worshiping. And then the last one, let me see. Religion is blamed for all the evil and conflict in the world. So you ought to look back on my previous podcasts because those are really good questions or statements that he challenges. So I want to go back an earlier part of his book. Why does he still believe in God? So he's got a chapter called God Makes Sense of Human Value. And we've lost that today, it seems like. It says, why are we even asking the question about, people being heard and things like that? He says, but the supposedly obvious truth that people have value isn't obvious to everyone on the planet. So he says, sometimes you find people that kill others and think that's not a problem. So he says, what were you going to say to the killer who judges another life as worthless? If you have a universe that doesn't have a God, just blindly obeying the laws of nature, he says, then there's nothing intrinsically special about us. There's no reason why humans should have any more claim for some kind of special regard than a louse. He said, why do we think there's some value? He said, it's because we have the value of our Maker imprinted on us. So the value of the rest of the living world is implicit in the role that he hands image bearers to take care of the earth. So Genesis, go back to Genesis. What does it say there? Justin says, God created humans in his own image. And he was actually willing to take human form himself in the person of Jesus and gave up his life for us. And as Brierley points out, that gives humans enormous worth, a life that's valued by anything else. I mean, think of the things that people hang their dependence on and what they value the most: money, education, health, productivity. But those things can go away, and it turns the human worth into a commodity. What you can do, what your value is. And in the end, it's going to make some people disposable. That's a pretty chilling word, but unfortunately, that's true. We've seen that over and over again. If you don't produce, if you're the wrong skin color, if you're the wrong religion, then we can get rid of you. You don't have any innate value. He says in 1948, the UN ratified what they call the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And at the very beginning, it said that they recognize the inherent dignity, this is a quote, and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. They said that's a foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. Yeah, it is, but we've stripped that away, haven't we? So he says that what he wants to do in this chapter is that the idea that we're free and equal with inherent dignity, that's only going to make sense if there's a God. And he said that's part of what he calls the moral argument. He said previously in the book, and I've read through the book, of course, he said that earlier he talks about exterior evidences, looking out at the universe and things that seem to need an explanation for why something is here and why everything's so organized. But he said, in this case, we're going to turn our gaze inwards and look at our own intuitions. And he said, you're going to hear people say that morality is subjective, that there's no universal standard of good and evil, but that each individual gets to decide for himself or herself what's right or wrong. But he said, we may disagree over some moral issues, but he said there are probably some things that we both believe are correct without exception. So he said if somebody falls over in the road, we should help them and check that they're all right. We try to be honest. We try to keep our word, act fairly, generosity, things like that. And he said that there are some things that he said you and I both think that they're always wrong, like abusing little children. He said it just turns his stomach to have to read stories like that. And he said, so these moral beliefs where we say they're not controversial at all, he says we should call those objectively true. not because we happen to agree on them. He said objective morality isn't decided by a popularity poll, but they're objectively true because when we think about it, we just know that they must always be true. And what happens if we get rid of that objective standard? Then all of our moral beliefs become opinion. They just become feelings. So he said, for example, if you have a culture out there that believes in female genital mutilation, you find it awful, you can object. You can say, well, my culture doesn't like that. But if morality is subjective, that's the end. There's no more argument. It's just the way you feel. What moral authority do you have in you to tell other people that they can't do something, that it's wrong? They just have a different opinion. But that doesn't make any sense. If something is really wrong, it's really wrong for everybody. So he said, the only way you can tell somebody they ought to do something, like stop practicing female genital mutilation or not abusing kids, we can only tell people to stop doing it or they ought to do something else is if it's really true. So he said, if there's a realm of facts about moral values and duties, then we have to ask, where does that realm come from? How can it be accounted for by an atheist? The only way that we could speak about things being truly right and wrong is if there's a reality about these matters which stands apart from the material world. Now that's crucial. In other words, if there's no God, you believe one thing, I believe something else, who's going to settle that issue, right? It's just a matter of opinion. But there's got to be a standard beyond us. I think that's really true. He says he remembers hosting a radio discussion when the United Kingdom started in 2008 an atheist bus campaign. Richard Dawkins got behind it, and pretty soon there were buses going through London that said, probably there's no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And it was a journalist named Ariane Shireen, and so she's the one that came up with that. So he had her on the show. And he said, he asked her, so where do we get evolution? She said, well, our morality changes over time. There's no need to be religious to lead a good moral life. And she spoke about things like the rape of women in Darfur, Sudan. And Justin Brierley said, I didn't disagree with her. We both agree that those acts were evil. He said, I did press her. Did she concur with me that certain acts like rape are absolutely wrong? Not just a matter of opinion or social rules produced by evolution. And she had a hard time with that, he said. Could we agree that rape for the purpose of power is absolutely wrong? Yes. She agreed that was wrong. Then she said, can we move on? That was upsetting. Well, that's kind of interesting, upsetting. In other words, she doesn't want to admit that there is some objective standard. Where'd that come from? He said, exposes the problem for atheists. They affirm the subjective nature of morality, and then when you give them some horrendous, truly horrendous act, they don't just feel that it's wrong, they are wrong. Those acts are wrong, period. He talks about when atheists convert, and some of them that have dealt with this moral issue. He said C.S. Lewis. First he stopped being an atheist, became a theist, and then because of Tolkien and others, he became a Christian. And the moral realm was part of what changed him. He wrote in his book, Mere Christianity, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? That's the moral argument. There was a woman named Leah Libresco. She was on his show. She converted to Christianity. Why? She was an out-and-out atheist, but that moral argument got away from her. She just worked away at her. She couldn't shake the belief that some things were really right and wrong, not just her feelings or cultural preferences. And so she changed and became a Christian. Pretty powerful. Libresco said this, morality is something we discover, like archaeologists, not something we build, like architects. Christianity offered an explanation for it that was compelling. Now, one Christian speaker said that there was a skeptical student who came up to him after a lecture and said, no, there's no real objective good and evil. And here's what the conversation took place with other students there. So the Christian speaker said, I'd like to ask you a question. If I took a 2-year-old child and brought the child up here on this platform and took a sword and cut that child to bits, would you think I'd done something wrong? And this is the answer. It just horrifies me. The student is trying to insist there's no objective realm of good and evil, but he's just heard this awful account. And here's what the student said. I would not like it, would not enjoy it, but I can't really say you had done something wrong. I said the people standing around were aghast. Yeah, exactly. So down deep, most people do recognize the moral reality that's embedded in the universe, and it changes people's minds. Okay, so the next section of this chapter, Brierley takes on 5 objections that the non-believer is going to come up with to this idea of morality as pointing to God. Here's the first one. How dare you? I live a moral life. I don't need to believe in God to be a good person. And Brierley says, yeah, I agree. That's not the claim he's making. He said people think it is, but says the problem is you can't make sense of moral beliefs without there being a God. So if you abandon God in some society, they abandon the Christian idea of the sanctity of life, and you get Stalin's gulags, you get the killing fields of Cambodia. Atheists who live a good moral life are normally a product of societies already shaped by centuries of Judeo-Christian morality. So I don't need to believe in God to be a good person. True. But how do you ground that goodness? Is it just because you feel like being good? Well, then somebody else can feel like being bad. You've got to have a set of morality that comes from beyond the human race. All right, so number 2, here's another objection. Well, there are plenty of moral systems out there and philosophies. I could adopt a code of ethics from them. I don't need God. So Brierley says, well, you might have struck upon a moral theory for the correct way to behave. That's great. But he said, if you want those beliefs to be more than your personal opinion, see, we're back to that again, and you think they should apply to other people, you can't escape the need for God. The moral argument is not about how you got to your beliefs, but how you ground them as true and binding for everybody. And that's crucial. I think that's the heart of this entire argument. So let me say that one more time. So the moral argument is not about how you came up with your moral beliefs, but how you ground them as true and then binding for everybody. In other words, oughts and shoulds and need to. Right? How can you say that kind of stuff if there's no God? Number 3, here's another complaint that he hears. Well, that's all very well, but how can your God be the source of morality when the Bible's so full of immorality? He says, that's changing the topic, isn't it? Whether the Bible is a good source of moral teaching. He says there's nothing wrong with that question, but it's a separate debate. So the moral argument only says, let's talk about the beliefs you personally hold. You don't need to believe in the Bible to acknowledge that there are objective moral values out there, and that needs a moral lawgiver. So I thought he got past that one very easily. Number 4, here's another objection. Evolution drives morality. We get our moral codes because society flourishes when we cooperate. It's got nothing to do with God. He says that's the most common response he hears. He hears them say, well, moral values, that's just a social framework so we can get along with each other, like the golden rule. He said, but it still leaves unanswered the question of why we should expect anyone to abide by them. You can't get an ought from an is. You tell me how my morality came about. That doesn't tell me why I should obey it. Why is something like the golden rule binding on me or anybody else? Oh, but because we build a better society that way. But Brierley says, wait a minute. You just smuggled in the very thing we're debating. By talking about a better society or human flourishing, you're assuming there's some kind of objective standard that we're measuring things by. So that is objective morality after all. Good point, huh? Number 5, he says, all right, answer me this. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? That's called Euthyphro's dilemma. If something is good just because God says it is, that makes morality pretty arbitrary. He can make anything good or evil. But if God commands something because he already knows it's good, then you don't need God. There's some kind of moral value out there independent of him. So he said that's a false dichotomy. There's actually a third option, right? That God wills something because he is good. So it's God's own nature that determines what's good. All right, so that gets you past that problem. He's got a section here on humanism. I'll go fast past that. He says that's what atheists like to call themselves. It sounds better. I'm a humanist. He said there's a atheist who unjustly has taken humanism as if it's only for atheists. There's a long history of Christian humanism as well. Let's go back to why are humans special? So there's the humanists again. They got together. They had a World Humanist Congress in 2002, and they signed a declaration that said, we affirm the worth, dignity, and autonomy of the individual and the right of every human being to the greatest possible freedom compatible with the rights of others. Well, wait a minute, he says. Why should humanists value humans so highly, and on what grounds should they treat themselves differently from any other part of the naturally evolved world? So Christianity is the one that provides the best foundation for those human values that's in that World Humanist Congress. Christianity provides more secure foundations for humanist values than atheism does. So he says humanists should believe in Christianity. That's a good point. He mentions the Australian philosopher Peter Singer. He says, if you think this is Singer now, if you think humans are more valuable than animals, that's speciesism. Instead, he said, we need personhood. So if you want to have value, you've got to be able to reason, experience pleasure and pain, and have a desire to live. That's how you should determine the rights of an individual. So guess what? You're going to end up with some highly developed animals that will qualify for similar rights, as well as those of humans. He's even suggested that newborn babies, they lack those qualities of personhood, and so infanticide might be permissible. He said, wow, he said, you might find that idea horrific. He said, I do. But it is the chillingly logical conclusion of getting rid of the idea that human life is inherently valuable. So do you see what Singer is saying? Human life is only valuable when it functions a certain way, when it produces something. And so he said that's pretty sad there. So he comes back at the end that God is the best explanation, which we've been talking about. He said, down to the tiniest newborn baby, there's a unique and fundamental dignity of humans. So he said, I bet you believe like I do that an individual's value is not determined by their age or their mental ability or skin color or success, the kind of money they have, usefulness to society. He said, the catch is we do measure people sometimes because we've abandoned the standard by which God measures them. So everybody is loved by God and they should be cherished by us. So he wraps up the chapter by saying he's trying to persuade people of two things. First, that humans do have real inherent worth and dignity that goes way beyond any purely evolutionary story of how we got morality. And secondly, if humans have such value, then it only makes sense that if there is someone beyond nature who can assign them such value, that's the God who created them in his own image. So he said, it only makes sense to have value for humans if there's something beyond this world that created them. So he says, kind of interesting, people that talk about, there's no such thing as objective morality, said they don't act like that in the real world. If they get mugged or they get swindled, they get treated unfairly, all of a sudden morality looks pretty objective to them and universally binding. So he said that it's hard for them to live in the world of morality. So I think that's a good way to end the chapter. All right, so that's Justin Brierley. I think you'd enjoy this book. It's powerful. Tim Keller says believers and non-believers and the many in between would be helped by the book. It's unbelievable with a question mark. Justin Brierley. You might take a look at his show. Listen to that sometime. He's a good guy. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast.